I must confess a couple of things, one of which is just repeating something Tony said earlier. When I was invited to come here, it's my third time here now, and I really like to come, and this, I agree, this environment has been wonderful. I've learned a great deal. When I was invited, I had very little idea quite what I was going to do with the notion of surprise, although I knew concretely where I was going to go with it. But, you know, Tony told me, Natalie said it's important, so, so here we are. Let me say a little bit about how I'm going to give an extended example to try and pull out some things that have already been said. So I'll be repeating things we've heard here already for the last day and a half now. But let me say something about the longer look I'm taking on it. With regard to the philosophy of history, I've always been sort of interested in what Eric Voegelin calls torsion or turbulence in history, sort of dramatic turnings. For some of us, an interesting example is the sudden appearance of someone like Machiavelli in political thought, how that's possible in Florence so soon after, you know, the apex of a very classical worldview and political worldview you get from someone like Dante in the same city. Well, if you look a bit more closely, you understand that there's a lot going on that explains that kind of turn. I'm going to talk about a different example today, and that's St. Paul. And I think St. Paul is actually, there's considerably more turbulence there, although I hope to show that with regard to Paul in the philosophy of history, the emergence of traditions, and even specifically what qualifies as his surprise, it's far from unintelligible. As Tony said, you know, I do some of my work in psychoanalysis. I had a training when I was in graduate school. I work quite a bit in phenomenology. Those discourses will be present in what I say, but and they guide me in terms of an interest in the meaning of surprise, and in particular this specific surprise. But you know, it's also an exercise in the philosophy of Christianity, which I do also with some of my time. My guiding intention in going to Paul is pretty much this, and I've already said it in a different way. I think actually, if we look closely, we see that the situation is far more complicated and therefore far more qualified with regard to surprise than the religious tradition, at least, leads us to expect. So I'm going to offer some methodological remarks. I'm going to say a few things that have been said in different ways already, and then I will come to Paul for a while. For many of us, the phenomenon of surprise brings to mind the image of sudden interruption, discontinuity, and even reversal of previous conditions. Of course, often enough, this does have a measure of plausibility, at least if we restrict ourselves to the hic et nunc of the experience itself. Whereas previously something was absent or unknown to me, it's now present before me. Or whereas previously things appeared to me in a particular way, I am made to see that in fact things are otherwise. This can provoke a sense of dread, as when a new realization undermines an entire worldview, but it can also be invigorating. The former possibility has become well known to us through the work of existential psychiatry and psychology. That's already on the table in discussion, and I think there'll be more of it in the next day or two. Well, we find an interesting study of the latter possibility in some passages of Henri Bergson's book on laughter. Applying himself to the sort of stage comedy in which assumed conditions and familiar movements suddenly fail, you know, the clown stumbles over a chair that we now realize had been there all along, it was just invisible, this kind of thing. Bergson suggests that the true source of our laughter is found in a sense of escape from the impersonal objectivity that has just been pierced. We're not mechanisms ordered to fixed patterns that regulate our movement, but rather living beings whose every movement is first a free creativity. And in our laughter, we give expression to a deep sense of this condition. As a discrete event, what surprises does so by disrupting a range or sequence of repeatable events. It explodes the ordered pattern with all the force of an element or an atom that does not quite belong there. Whereupon, let's follow Bergson's thinking through to the end. I go now to matter and memory very briefly. the inward shock that constitutes our feeling of surprise is quickly diminished in a return to what we experience as, quote, the familiar. After all, our feeling of surprise often quickly passes, and indeed, few jokes to none can be repeated without losing their original force. They become, as I've just suggested, part of the fabric of the familiar. The account of laughter and comedy and so on doesn't matter very much. It's actually pretty strange and limited. It makes you wonder what sort of person a person was, actually, to pick on those kinds of things. I'm after a structure that I want to highlight and then I want to challenge. So the appearance of a dimension of familiarity in the overall experience of surprise introduces an important complication for the present investigation. Whereas there is only equivocation in our everyday use of the word surprise, equivocation, use of surprise to designate both an event and a response to an event, so terminological equivocation, there is genuine ambiguity about the function and the meaning of familiarity in relation to the disruption that surprises. Let me take them in order. The equivocation is easily dissolved by distinguishing between an event that surprises and the feeling of surprise that arises in response to it. I'm not sure we've quite cleared up what that feeling is, but it's something. This serves to highlight the ambiguity. In fact, it's twofold. Sorry to be tedious. To begin with, it's not immediately clear whether the general familiarity that is interrupted by the event that surprises us therefore had excluded that event or only differs from it. Those are two different things. And could have included it. That's not clear. Now, I think we might hesitate before the idea that a surprising event is strictly opposed to all previous conditions, without any continuity with them. And we might anticipate that in the absence of any continuity whatsoever, the event that surprises must be meaningless. Such a concern hangs most prominently over the entire philosophy of Levinas, for whom the face of the other person is pure self-expression arriving from beyond any horizon centered on the subject. In a sense, you could begin rereading Levinas around this question. So I understand the claim the face of the other is a shock, a surprise, he says, trauma, and so on. Well, in that case, how does it mean anything at all to me? He's not without answers to that question, but he's hard-pressed to develop them as the work goes along. So the face is a shock and even a trauma by which the very subjectivity of the subject is thrown back on itself to a point from which either of only two general possibilities arise. One might be converted from being for oneself into being for the other, or one for the other, he says. Or one might recede back into insistence on oneself and indeed the comforts of the familiar. Without venturing into a detailed interrogation of Levinas's grounds for these claims, let's only note that an argument organized to defend the absolute otherness of the other, or we could say the absolute novelty of the new, requires the thought of an event that cannot be understood by the subject except at cost of already falsifying what gives itself to be seen in the surprise of its appearance. This view, for example, Levinas's view, would require us to think that when we experience some surprise, we are, as subjects, already beginning to forget what surprises us, or lose what surprises us. And in turn, this severe claim plainly implies a reduction of the life of the subject to the dynamism of a reinforcement of sameness. That, as some of Ricoeur's later work, for example, reminds us, we ought not to concede too easily. The subjectivity of the subject, to most of us, looks considerably more complicated than simply a kind of narcissistic reinforcement of sameness. And this has historically been an objection Ricoeur, among others, pressed to Levinas repeatedly. Okay, so much for the first fold of the ambiguity. A second ambiguity, close to the first one, lies in the difference between thinking that the familiar is essentially a projection of the subject as it seeks to make itself at home in the world, and thinking that to some degree the familiar arises from the manner in which the world lends itself to the givenness of all data to consciousness. These are two different things, once again. It's one thing to say the familiarity of what is around me or surrounds me is determined by my inner psyche. It's a projection. It's another thing to say there are folds of or dimensions of projection that anchor or connect with the givenness of the world. Maybe the world gives itself to the use I make of it. Here we might ask whether the very notion of surprise presupposes not merely a being who is in the world, but more than that, one whose relation to the world includes a basic competence with the milieu of every encounter. And we might anticipate that without some such competence with the world, the notion of surprise would be meaningless. Not because it could never occur, but to the contrary, because the category of surprise would then include every experience in which a datum is given to a consciousness would be, by definition, wholly unprepared for it. I think this is important. Our relation to the world is an essential feature of the experience of surprise. It's not merely the subject being stricken by something, by an external datum. This is already enough for us to recognize that even when it is a matter of a datum that arrives from beyond expectation, chapeau to Tony, expectation, anticipation, there's probably a lot to think out there. Even when it is a matter of a datum that arrives from expectation, the intelligibility of the experience depends in some important measure on the condition of the subject and its relation to the world in which it lives. I therefore situate my own thoughts here this morning within a general hermeneutics of surprise by which, if we are to approach fidelity to the thing itself, phenomenology is included. Okay? Okay. If we are to approach fidelity to the thing itself in its concrete occurrence, we would have to differentiate among forms and degrees of surprise by attending to the context in which they occur, historical, cultural, personal, psychological, and so on, though without surrendering the possibility of grasping their inner unity in some irreducible essence. That at least would be the aim or the trajectory of the work. Now, as far as I can see, it is inevitable that a lot of this work would have to proceed by way of attending to specific examples. As I began by saying, on this occasion, my example will be the episode commonly called the conversion of St. Paul. So really, I want for the most part to just conduct a hermeneutical investigation of the remarkable surprise that defines an entire vocation for Paul and indeed makes the entire Christian tradition afterward, or marks it, sorry. And that's to say that, although I'll have to go into some theological discussion, that's not my first interest here. We can talk about that afterward if you like, but in a certain sense it doesn't matter all that much for the phenomenology of surprise. Few to none of us are likely to have undergone greater surprise than did Paul on the road to Damascus. And as I just said, few with greater consequence. Let's recall the account of Paul's experience given in the Acts of the Apostles. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, the followers of Jesus, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he journeyed, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him. Or the suddenly it's a dramatic word, echaifnes. It has a powerful resonance in late Platonic, Neoplatonic, and the entire Christian, and probably the Jewish mystical tradition. Echaifnes. Suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And Saul replied, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. I'll come back to that. Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. Paul's own references to this event, there are a few of them. In his own references to this event, he seconds some of the key features in the Lucan account that I just read. The author, the name of the author, commonly associated with the text called Acts of the Apostles, is said to be Luke, who also wrote the gospel by that name. And by the way, when I go on now, I'm just going to always say Paul rather than go back and forth between Saul and Paul. As you probably know, he changed his name from Saul, which I think means prayed for, to Paul after this event. Paul, by the way, means something like at peace, which I find counterintuitive when I read Paul, but okay. All right. Defending the authority of his message, Paul tells the Galatians, I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Apocalypseos Jesu Christou. And to the Corinthians, he claims that although he came after the apostles who lived and walked with Jesus, nonetheless, quote, he appeared also to me, opthe kamoi. And I have seen him. So let's note first that whatever suddenly happened to Paul was a matter of revealing, seeing, and appearing. Before exploring this nexus of themes further, we should immediately consider 2 points about the seeing that Paul invokes, at least in 1 Corinthians 9, which I just cited. On the one hand, his word eroaka, which derives from orao, has only a general sense of perceiving or even simply experiencing that does not by itself fully support an association specifically with ocular vision. So what does the word seeing mean here? One thinks rather of seeing with the mind or seeing spiritually. On the other hand, there can be no question that a strong sense of the reality of what is seen, this is, among other things, psychiatrically interesting, the reality of what is seen, that it truly was Jesus, was crucial for the authority of any apostolic teaching, including, as I've already noted, Paul's own and in his own view. It was very important to say, although I didn't live and walk with Jesus, I did see him. I really saw him. This is also the sense of his word apocalypseos, which signals knowledge achieved in the coming to light of what was previously unseen. So let's say very generally that at the heart of the event in the road to Damascus is a revelation by which it suddenly becomes possible for Paul to know something previously invisible to him, so long as he was seeing according to the powers and from the perspective that had served him up to that point. A surprising revelation that has an important cognitive content. This brings us to a second factor, at least if we return now to Acts 9. Those with whom Paul traveled did hear a voice, but saw no one. Somewhat later, as I already noted, Paul himself tells the Galatians and the Corinthians that Jesus was revealed and appeared to him, so he saw something. And on his account, this is quite important. Now, here we have a puzzle between Paul seeing and his companions not seeing, only so long as we continue to equate seeing with ocular vision, which I already called into question. So the puzzle disappears when we envision everyone present to have seen, to have heard a voice, Paul to have understood it. That is, only if we envision only Paul. I'm sorry, let me start over. The puzzle disappears when we envision everyone to have heard a voice, but only Paul to have understood. That is, if we envision only Paul to have seen Jesus in the sense of knowing what his words meant. For Paul's companions, whatever the voice said will have been unintelligible or perhaps intelligible but untrue or maybe even nonsensical. After all, they weren't swayed by what they heard so much as perplexed and evidently frightened. If you look back at the passage around detailing the episode and what follows, you get the sense they couldn't get rid of Paul soon enough. They sort of dumped him on Anitis and they were gone, which, did tend to happen to Paul in his life. As for Paul, we should be careful in our interpretation of response to what had suddenly befallen him. If, in contrast with his companions, he plainly was moved in some way by what he had heard, still there's no reason to necessarily conclude that he accepted everything then and there. If you read more attentively, there's actually suggestion to the contrary. Acts 9 tells us only that he was struck blind. And in his letter to the Galatians, he seems to indicate that he spent another 3 years in Arabia, that's his word, before making his way to Jerusalem and then on to his ministry to the Gentiles. But even here, we should move slowly. Did Paul begin immediately proselytizing in Arabia to the uncultured Nabateans? They seem to have been a very primitive people, right? So it seems to me that he probably went away to think it all over and to work out what had, dramatically overturned him in an entire world. It's a powerful surprise. It changed his very worldview. So did he proselytize there to the Nabateans only to return to Jerusalem without leaving any record of success? This seems extremely unlikely given what we know of Paul, that he would omit accounts of success. Or were the years in Arabia spent digesting the impact and the import of his surprise on the road to Damascus? Perhaps, maybe, sometimes, occasionally making futile attempts to proclaim it. But then, on to Jerusalem, only when he had achieved some resolution about what it had all meant, some clear understanding of who he was now in light of his surprise. And at that point, he feels prepared to encounter James and Peter, the undisputed leaders of the Christian way. Now, lacking a means to really decide that question, quite what Paul was up to during those 3 years, we can at least say that the light and the voice left an impression already then and there on the road that made it impossible for him to continue as he had been up to that point. And if at first this meant only that he was unable to proceed with plans to obtain letters by which to identify and persecute more followers of Jesus, there is nonetheless unbroken consistency between the end of his persecutions and what eventually becomes a mission to preach the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If the fact that Paul, unlike his companions, was stunned by what he saw and heard, requires us to think that it reaches him in a way that it did not reach them, the fact that his subsequent path moves progressively away from his hostility to the followers of Jesus suggests that what thus reached him in the surprising voice did have a specific content that made a decisive claim on his very understanding even of himself. Now, we shouldn't fail to recognize that such a claim, powerful and yet intimate, is certain to have an effect on the body of the one who is claimed. And by the way, the matter of Paul and his body, his theory of body is really something for, I think, an interesting independent investigation. You may know that the distinction he makes between the flesh, which is a sort of root of the kind of desiring that Doug Berger was talking about yesterday, and the lived body. There are distinct Greek words for this, sarx and soma. What goes with that is a pluralization of wills. And what becomes of that is a kind of resolution into a higher unity grasped or achieved through, cleaving to Christ. That's one side of what Paul says about the body. If we're going to pursue that a bit further, though, we'd have to look closely at these mystical experiences where he feels bound to Christ. And there you find something considerably more disturbing, it seems to me. He says in 2 Corinthians 12, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up into the third heaven. He's talking about himself. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows. And he repeats that a few lines later. This kind of dissociative experience that prompts reflection that would take us very far afield. But anyway, the idea of Paul, the relationship of Paul to his body, his theory of body is extremely interesting. That said, here even more than elsewhere, there is little by which to find our way. As I've noted already, Acts 9 tells us that the experience left Paul blind for 3 days. Among experts, there is considerable speculation about the medical nature of Paul's condition, but the most widely accepted view, at least as I've been able to determine these days, seems to be that he suffered from an affliction that rendered him prone to infection and inflammation of the eyes. That does square well with certain passages that might otherwise elude our understanding. He refers at least once to a bodily ailment that rendered him disgusting to those who saw him, and elsewhere to a thorn in the flesh received from God in order to prevent him from pride at his apocalyptic vision. Whether, as the author of Acts and Paul himself both clearly think, his temporary blindness was fully caused by an apocalypse of Jesus the Christ, or only precipitated by what he thought he saw and heard on the road to Damascus, it's evident that blindness itself is a corporeal expression of Paul's profound sense of surprise. Now, I'm contented to leave it to the psychoanalysts, I'm not wearing that hat for the moment, to interpret the possible significance of a blindness that ensues from a light in which Paul saw what he would soon enough describe as Paul's victory over death. Right? I mean, there's an evident castration of Paul's identity at work there. This is everything that he had opposed at the very root of his being until a moment ago. Let's leave that aside and instead hold fast to a singular fact. This victory will not have been achieved, Christ's victory over death, will not have been achieved exclusively from within the Jewish tradition in which Paul had been raised and schooled and of which he had been a fervent advocate, but instead by someone whose followers he had considered deserving of the most aggressive persecution. I'm lining that up a bit roughly. We can nuance that a bit later, if you like. This thought concerning Jesus, at the very least as a real possibility, will have thrown the zealous Jew into the grave crisis that surely lies at the root of his physical complaint. Otherwise, why is it even mentioned? And so at last we come to the question of Paul's emotional state, or his affective condition, when he heard and saw Jesus. As we've seen, this occurred in a revelation not at his own initiative, and somehow such that he alone received it in its fullness. Paul was thus singled out, set apart from his companions, as well as, of course, the comfort of his own identity, though without necessarily passing immediately into the Christian faith that defined his later public life. This way of seeing the episode leads us to consider as a working hypothesis, seems almost inevitable to me given the philosophical background most of us are bringing into this discussion, we should at least consider as a working hypothesis Heidegger's notion of anxiety. It's a matter of attunement to one's own groundlessness, or to what he has sometimes called the abyss of meaning. Now, for this interpretation of Paul to hold, we would have to think that between his Jewish and Christian faith there was a moment, perhaps a very long moment, in which Paul not only was without any faith at all, but felt that the only meaning of any kind originated from his own mortal cares and very limited capacity for understanding. Paul would have been left to his finitude. Let me simply note for the moment that this feeling, anxiety, as interpreted, would already be an interpretation at the level of affect of what had reached him so unexpectedly on the road to Damascus. Other possibilities were certainly possible. Of course, we could parse the experience further and ask whether there is a difference between the call itself, the moment in which Paul was surprised by it, and the anxiety that may have ensued. Such a proposal does help us to see more clearly that Paul was properly surprised only upon assigning to the call some meaning that pertained directly to him in his worldview. And I would think, before there arose in him an anxiety that interprets the meaning of the surprise. Let me repeat that. Such a proposal does help us to see more clearly that Paul was properly surprised only upon assigning to the call, at some level in himself, assigning to the call some meaning that pertained directly to him in his worldview. And I would think before there arose in him an anxiety that already begins to interpret or respond to a deep interpretation of the meaning of the surprise. There's a lot to sort out there, but let's leave it there for now. In short, unless the surprise does not already entail within itself some meaning, the rise of any particular emotion, such as anxiety, would be difficult to explain. But even with these refinements in mind, we should not conclude too easily that thus specific emotion Paul felt upon hearing the voice of Jesus was anxiety. After all, this would leave unanswered the question of just how he regained faith in the one God after he would, by definition, have lost it. Moreover, precisely what anxiety seems necessarily to suspend, openness to divine transcendence, will have been a feature of Paul's subjectivity both as a Jew and as a Christian. Would that only be a matter of resemblance between beliefs on either side of a hiatus, his Jewish belief, then a moment of anxiety, and Christian belief with a matter of resemblance between the faith on either side of anxiety? Or is that openness to divine transcendence the unifying principle of an entire way of being that is, to be sure, compelled to redefine itself? There are two ways to approach this question. We could attend to what we can learn of Paul's Judaism as he set out on the road to Damascus, where a profound sense of experience of surprise interrupted it. And or we may attend to the Christianity in which we might see the outline of his response to it. The former approach seeks an account of Paul's disposition as Jesus suddenly called to him. I'm going to spend more time on that. The latter might provide us with a sense of how he integrated the experience. I'll say just a very little bit about that and invite you to consult the Pauline correspondence, where, in fact, he's speaking from this all the time, of course. We know that at least by the time of young adulthood, correct me if I get any of this wrong, Paul was an adherent to Pharisaic Judaism, a movement whose zeal was expressed in attempts to memorize much of the Hebrew Bible and in a fervent commitment to the law as defined by a personal master or father. When, at about age 21, Paul made his way from Tarsus in the north down to Jerusalem, it was in order to advance in his learning under such a master. This he did for 4 years, emerging finally as a fledgling master of Pharisaism in his own right. The name of his own master during his training is not known, for certain at least, but we do know the name of a great teacher who, by Paul's own account, affected him greatly. This was Gamaliel, who was born into the third generation of a family of prominent leaders, all esteemed as well as religious authorities. The author of Acts takes note of this in chapter 34, referring to Gamaliel as a Pharisee and a teacher of the law held in honor by the people. Gamaliel's influence on his people seems to have been immense, extending beyond the impact of his interpretation and formal judgments concerning the law to include an instruction by example that could involve virtually anything he was seen to do in public. Try wearing that authority for a while. In this way, Gamaliel touched all of the Pharisaic community, if not directly, then according to the measure in which his important presence had to be taken into the reckoning of any teaching proposed by lesser masters. This is probably how to understand the statement attributed to Paul in Acts 22 to the effect that he studied in Jerusalem, quote, at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, of Gamaliel's views, the traditions have recorded only a few statements, unfortunately, though in the course of an attempt to understand Paul, at least two of them are certainly of interest. In the Mishnah, Gamaliel is said to have taught, quote, seek a teacher for yourself. And in religious questions, hold yourself far from doubt and do not often give a tithe according to general valuation. The entirety of this teaching is in recognizable solidarity with the main lines of Pharisaism, but the emphasis on the importance of a teacher should be understood in context. As I've said, Gamaliel himself was a teacher of extraordinary influence. In fact, he's thought to be the first in the Jewish tradition to have been honored with the title of rabbi. Though a commitment to authoritative religious teaching was hardly new in the time of Gamaliel, previously it was identified more strictly with judgeship, as distinct from the roles of kingship, prophecy, and ritual priesthood. But in Gamaliel's own time, the roles of kingship and ritual priesthood were already in decline, and the age of the prophets was widely thought to have ended. So that his exhortation to secure a teacher must have had a particular urgency for his people, among them, plainly enough, Paul. In other words, everything depended on finding the right teacher. Second of Gamaliel's teachings is found in an intervention recorded by the author of Acts. Learning that a group of zealous Pharisees wished to put to death some of the apostles, Gamaliel reminded them of similar regrettable events in recent times, and then he advised, quote, "So in the present case, I can tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if the apostles or these men's plan and undertaking is only of men, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God." That's from Acts 5. Now, it's not certain that this citation is fully authentic. There are echoes of it in non-Christian texts, so there seems to be something to it. But it does illustrate a remarkable tolerance consistent with the Hillel school of which Gamaliel was the head. These two passages I've just been discussing support the following thought about Paul the Pharisaic Jew on his way to Damascus. He not only, like other Jews of the day, sought a great teacher, but knew that the one who enjoined such a search, Gamaliel himself, was prepared to tolerate the fledgling movement following Jesus Christ. That said, we're very tempted at this point to say, well, he was just sort of in step with Gamaliel, and that held him open to what happened on the road to Damascus. There's a problem. We really can only suppose that this is a notion familiar to Paul. Evidently not an accepted rule for his behavior. Don't forget, not long after Gamaliel is said to have urged tolerance, Paul was found at the stoning of the Christian martyr Stephen. Right? So we don't have the grounds to say more than Paul probably knew of an exhortation, seek a great teacher, and knew of an attitude within Judaism that might be open and tolerant towards at least coexisting or letting live the followers of Jesus. Right? This already softens our sense of the impact of the voice on the road to Jerusalem. This likely conflict in Paul between the zealotry of his Pharisaic Judaism and these other things that he was almost certainly aware of is not unrelated to another one in the Judaism of Paul's day that will have contributed to his disposition as he departed for Damascus. On one hand were the Pharisees, himself surely included, who were intent on developing an oral tradition that would protect the law, so that the marks of Jewish fidelity and election could remain clear. On the other hand was a marginal apocalyptic movement within Judaism in which, without questioning the importance of the law, there was concern with, openness to, fascination with in some cases, the end of all ages, defined by a messianism that was, seems to me, rather more a transcendental condition than the meaning or achievement of a single historical political figure. Here again, it's dangerous to suppose more than a notion or maybe a possibility known to Paul as he executed what he continued to understand as the proper Pharisaic definition of Jewish life. Still, these two hypotheses, the one concerning Gamaliel's call to a great teacher and his attitude of tolerance, the other concerning possible shifts in the conception of messianism, would go a long way toward better understanding some prominent features of the experience on the road to Damascus. Let's recall first that it was Paul alone who not only heard a voice, but also saw that it was Jesus. Perhaps his complex relation to his own Jewish identity included elements that rendered him, more than his companions, disposed to somewhat more than immediate rejection of the words spoken to him by Jesus. And so second, let's also keep in mind the fact that what was thus revealed to him, regardless of how much time we suppose it took him to fully understand it, affected the Jewish dimension of his identity much more significantly than it did the Greek and Roman dimensions. After all, Paul never quite gave up the habit of invoking his Roman citizenship when it suited him. He's about to be beaten, he says to, or jailed, and he says to a Roman centurion, "Is it right to do this to a Roman citizen?" Well, then everything changes. So he was rather attached to his Roman identity. His Greek education, such as it was, and scholars tell me this is rather overblown. He was not a great student of the Greek tradition. It was never really an important factor in the account he gave of himself to others. He tends to mention it in passing. His Greekness and his Romanness, in short, remained in loose complementarity with the rest of himself, but his Jewishness, henceforth, is shifted from prominence to something more like the antecedent condition of his turn to Jesus Christ. As for the surprising event itself, when it came to Paul, there are elements in the Jewish tradition of relatively little controversy that help us understand how it is that he would have been willing to receive a calling rather than dismissing it out of hand. There may have been in Paul, and in many Jews of that time, a particular disposition to hear the voice of God that has very deep roots in the tradition. Tony will know more about this than me. Of course, claims for this sort of experience do appear frequently in the Jewish Bible. So you think right away of the still small voice of Elijah, or the voice of God ringing on high to Ezekiel, or later on from Zion to Amos. But these were experiences of the prophets. As I already noted, by the time of Paul, it was thought that the age of the prophets had ended. And so, as if to answer for people's desire for divine manifestation, there emerged within 2 centuries of Paul's own time a new conception of the divine self-communication in a voice that may on occasion reach any fervent believer, and no longer only those few who had the gift of prophecy. So what I'm getting at here is the intensity, the urgency with which Paul probably was looking for God to speak somehow or other to him. As one might expect, there was uncertainty over quite how to think about this. Some teachers saw in it the sign of a new age and thus a new development in the relation to God. Others, without discrediting it entirely, nonetheless feared a decline into superstition and urged the supremacy of law. In any case, the name for this divine voice is Bloechl. Am I saying that right? Bloechl. There's an analog in the Christian tradition, the vox Dei, that sense of God speaking, which, interestingly enough, signifies something more like an echo of the original voice rather than the voice in its pure form. We would really have to apply ourselves to quite what that means, right? And by the way, there's even a further complication. A lot of sources on this notion of the divine voice at that time in Judaism say that it was probably feminine in origin, which is extremely interesting on all levels. But okay. Signifies something more like an echo of the original voice rather than the voice in its pure form. For God's own voice was thought to be super-sensible, whereas in order for it to reach a person lacking the special gift of prophecy, it had to become audible. To this should be added only the reminder that within the broader Jewish tradition of divine communication by voice and call, there are instances in which the one who hears the voice also does see something, though not God as God. So Moses, famously saw God's back as he passed by atop Mount Sinai. No one can see the face of God and live. Apparently, you can survive seeing God's back. I've not quite understood that, but okay. In Ezekiel's case, the voice of God is either accompanied by the hand of the Lord. You see this throughout the hagiography. Or sometimes it's said to be delivered by angels, and in the traditions, actually angels are sometimes virtually assimilated with the voice of God. Right? In any case, there's a kind of anthropomorphizing that goes on that seems to deal with this special difficulty of a super-sensible message somehow becoming audible to human beings. So let's suppose let's then suppose, again, but without overworking the point, that while there is no evidence at all that Paul actively adhered to this notion, the notion of the voice of God, it is more than possible that he would have known of it, and indeed, given the unmistakable fervor of his own faith during a time of some trial for the Jews of Jerusalem, he might well have at least sympathized with its evident motivation. Please, God, speak to us, and then if you're a bit egocentric, as I think Paul probably was, speak to me. And so, if brief exploration of Paul's relationship to Gamaliel and some cautious speculation about his possible awareness of an apocalyptic strand of first century Judaism have led me to propose that Paul's experience of surprise on the road to Damascus may have been prepared by elements that disposed him to understand it in a specific way, I'll now add that we might begin to see the basis for a desire to hear and see God in a context where Paul and his community had thought, no doubt to their great distress, that God had fallen silent. If these many speculations hold up, then we might conclude of Paul that he was not so much converted from one way of life to another that is entirely different, as he was called by a voice that spoke to a longing in his heart that had hitherto been directed by a range of commitments that turned him away from Christian faith, the very sight of which incited in him an all-too-ready aggression. Turn from all of that, without those deeply Jewish commitments quite closing him from the possibility of a positive reckoning with Jesus. To be sure, Paul did change his manner and his outlook to a degree that merits the word conversion, but there's no longer any reason, if there ever was one, to think that this resulted solely from the suddenness of divine initiative. To the contrary, properly speaking, the conversion took place within Paul as he registered the surprising call of Jesus within the rich array of notions and principles available to him and realized himself to be someone other than he had previously thought. And it's above all this phenomenon that I really wanted to have us discuss. The idea that a surprise can be so dramatic that it can change your very identity. They're rare, but we have to account for them phenomenologically. Whether or not this precipitated anxiety, such as Heidegger understands it, seems to me doubtful, since nothing supports the thought that Paul ever lost all faith that God exists. I have grave doubts about Heidegger's account of anxiety in general, but that's another issue. What now seems much more likely is that his great surprise left him troubled as to who God truly is and what might be his own relation to God. And it's, of course, precisely that becomes the substance of his preaching. So let me now turn, much more briefly, I promise, to the Paul whose new faith leads him so far as to declare very startling expression. And by the way, the texts are riddled with this, if you start to see it. Very startling expression. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Dramatic identification. Before going into it, let me just mark one more difficulty in the spirit of caution about these things. We should always be suspicious of or hesitant when attending to people's own accounts of what something like a surprise meant to them. It's often all that you have to go on, of course, but you can't, and we shouldn't, suspend the fact that they are now looking back on a dramatic event, or not always a dramatic event, but an important event from the perspective of having already integrated for themselves what it meant, right? And there is always something reductive about that, it seems to me. So let's not forget that. So, with that caution and some others in mind, I just restrict myself to the following matters now, specifically in Paul's letters, and this really won't take long. First, Paul's writing is without exception aimed at preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, by which is meant, writ large, that the resurrection of Jesus Christ fulfills the messianic hope long preserved in the Jewish tradition in which he had been formed. Second, this preaching is directed not only to the Jewish people, but all humanity, whether Greek or Jew, slave or free, male or female, Galatians 3. Third, This universalization of the Christian message is rooted in Paul's case in a distinctive conception of the human person, or if you prefer, our subjectivity, that is derived from Paul's own understanding of what was revealed to him on the road to Damascus. Extremely interesting that a highly personal experience like that becomes universalized in short order and founds an entirely new way of life and worldview, not only for Paul, but he says for all humanity. A moment ago, I observed that Paul's preaching emanates from an assimilation of his life with that of Jesus Christ. It's not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The theme of Christ in us, or us in Christ, that's not a distinction that seems to trouble Paul very much. It appears throughout his correspondence, Romans 8, 2 Corinthians 13, Galatians 4, etc., and it doubles as a description of our true condition and as an admonition for how to live. So there's no mistaking the point of arrival for Paul as he integrated the meaning of the surprising words he heard on the road. Overwhelmed by them, feeling himself and his convictions put suddenly in question, Paul submitted to the message entirely, taking it in as the new principle of his life and understanding. Identifying with one who had willingly given himself up to crucifixion, Paul, as it were, followed suit in extremis, emptying himself of all that centered on his own will in favor of all that is commanded by the will of Christ. Now this, philosophically, is recognizably an instance of, Tony used the word a couple of hours ago, an instance of decenterment, a notion we should associate as rigorously as possible with our reflections on surprise. Theologically, psychologically, it is stabilized but not dissolved in identification. I made that point already. Theologically, its specific form, the form of the resolution of his experience, is Christological. And let's not forget that the Pauline message, as I said, extends to all human beings. The Pauline subject is decentered by absolute commitment to Christ, wherein he finds the truth of our condition. In short, the experience on the road to Damascus has a mystical dimension. I think that that's the key to Paul's texts, rather than all the business about the law, which should be interpreted in light of this. It has a mystical dimension in which, however, is grasped a universal proposition concerning humanity. All right? I think I've gone on for a long time. I really had just a couple of other thoughts about the nature of causality that's at work here, and what sort of discourses are involved when we start to attribute to what on the level of experience strikes us as contingent, a kind of explanation. Do you follow me? A surprise by its very nature strikes us as contingent, out of joint with everything else. Now, when we try to understand it, we go looking for, roughly speaking, a cause. On the level of the natural attitude, that's perfectly understandable. When we shift to the level of discourse, we start looking for more than understanding, for some kind of explanation. Right? And we could talk for a long time about this. One way of banishing contingency from our account of a surprise is theological. It means this because God willed it to mean this. There is an interesting apposition between that theological move and what I am sometimes afraid of, although less in light of yesterday's discussion, sometimes afraid of in the scientific move, to look for an objective causal account of surprise. Okay, and that's really the last issue I wanted to raise, and I must admit, I don't know myself quite what to think about it except to utter it in the form of something of a worry. Okay, so I'll just stop with that.
Thanks, Doug.